Galatians chapter 1, verse 10. I want to begin reading into your hearing. And I'll read down to verse 15 or 16. If you have it, say, I've got it. For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I seek to please men? For if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. But I make known to you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but it came through the revelation of Jesus Christ. If you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son in me that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. That'll suffice. Look at somebody as you take your seat. Tell them, smile at them, and tell them, friend, there is power in your personal testimony. Amen. You can have your seat in the... Y'all say an extra quick prayer for me. I'm just full. That worship. I want to preach in this second sermon on this series that we've begun last week. I want to preach about the power of my personal testimony. Paul has started a church in Galatia. It is now some 50 years after the death and after the resurrection of Jesus. This church is beginning to grow, but yet as this church grows, there is a segment of the religious group called Judaizers. They don't disagree with what Paul has taught or preached. They simply want to add to what he's been preaching. They don't deny the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, but they want to add to the teaching. Much to the dismay of this church planter and apostle, he writes to them as he typically corresponds with them by writing since he has started the church. And he writes to them and he says, as I say to all of us at church today, that the gospel and salvation is not Jesus plus. It is Jesus, period. Matter of fact, help me preach and say, I'm not saved because something was added to Jesus. Jesus is enough. We live, Jesus is about transforming lives. Jesus is about life change. But the reality of it is that when Jesus changes my life, ultimately with salvation, he does not need to add anything to himself. We live in a culture that if we're not careful, you'll say, well, Pastor, I know that. But we forget that. We forget that, I'm going to keep saying it until we can all rehearse it and put it out on every platform we're on, that salvation is Jesus, period, not Jesus plus. And we live in a culture where if we're not careful, we allow the things that come with salvation to take a place equal to salvation. We allow in our thinking these fake gospels that Paul writes about. Pastor, make some clear for me. Well, let me make some clear, y'all. It's You can't have a prosperity gospel. Because Jesus does not need my bank account to save me. I should have had a whole lot more amens than I did, because the price we paid was so high that despite what I did have in my bank account, I would have come up short with my ability to be able to pay the price anyway. And so we have to kill the demon that tries to convince folk that because you might be struggling financially, it's because of some lack of relationship you have with God. It's lots of people that are broke that love Jesus. Lots of people that are sick, and it does not mean that they are out of the will of God. It just simply means that sometimes I can be saved and still need some more money. I can be saved and still be sick in my body, and Jesus does not need him and health to save me. He doesn't need him and money to save me. So we can't elevate prosperity. We can't even elevate, as much as I love it, activism. The gospel, once I'm saved, everybody say once I'm saved. The gospel, once I'm saved, calls me that if I want to see people live a better life, that there's sometimes I can't just pray my way through. That sometimes I've got to activate my way through. I've got to vote my way through. But there's a bunch of people that are registered to vote that's not saved, that's going to hell. So Jesus does not need my party affiliation to save me. He does not need my voting record to save me. When I get saved, I want to involve myself with those things, but I can't confuse it and say it's necessary for salvation. And the reason I'm preaching this is because so many times in our life, we think because I'm involved in all of the right things, that's good enough. The gospel is not Jesus and prosperity. The gospel is not Jesus and activism. The gospel is not Jesus and my social club. One of the worst reasons in the world, it's going to be a thunk in the room. But, you know, at the end of the day, I can't make my walk with God about fellowship and friendship. Uh-oh, it's quiet in the room. But I hope once I'm saved and that I'm saved, I will have fellowship and friendship in the house of God. But at the end of the day, if I don't have fellowship and friendship in the house of God, if I got God in the house of God, and if I got a word in the house of God, and see, so many of us are struggling because we may not be at a certain church because my family not there. Because my friends are not there. And if we're not careful, we make church and our growth and our walk and our salvation about fellowship. And even though fellowship is a part of it, God don't save me on the group plan. People talk all that, you know, I got saved on the family plan. That sound good, but it don't work like that. I can't make it about therapy. It doesn't mean that once I get saved, I don't need a counselor. Even before I get saved, I may need a counselor. But just because I'm in therapy, just because I have a weekly or a bi-monthly meeting with the counselor, does not mean I'm going to heaven. Paul says, pay attention to what I read, y'all. The gospel I'm preaching is not of my own or of man's invention. He says it's not even of man's tradition. That the gospel is about God's revelation. Might as well go ahead and park here and kill the demon. Which means that just because I'm involved with something man created, or just because I'm engaging in some tradition of the church, does not mean I'm saved. "11 a.m. worship was an advent of we got to get out of the field in time to worship. We live in a culture now where most folk who insist that if I don't have church at 11, I'm not having church. never been a slave. So we wind up making our walk with him, if we're not careful, Paul's saying, about the tradition of man. And at the end of the day, I can follow all of the tradition of man and still not be saved. And so what Paul is saying to us is that we have to focus on personal testimony. I love this passage, these few verses. I've never preached them in my life. I love them because they're so convicting to us. Paul begins where I want to begin. Paul is saying that there's some stuff I've got to get right about my testimony. Tell your neighbor, you've got a testimony. And y'all, I got to be careful that I need to protect my testimony. Can I park here for a moment and say something, y'all? Sometimes I mess up my own testimony by my lifestyle. I don't have any amens in the room. I said sometimes, see, it's like being in a court of law. They can call you on the stand. What you say could be true. But if they can challenge your lifestyle, then even though what you're saying may be true, those listening to it don't want to believe it. That's why I got to be careful how I live my life, because God's been too good. We've been singing it. He's been too good to me for me to mess up my testimony by how I live my life. But not only do we mess up our testimony sometimes by my lifestyle, sometimes, watch this, I mess up my testimony by who I associate with. Can I deliver the house? Are y'all ready to be delivered? So Paul opens up in verse 10, and what he says in verse 10 is, I'm not saying what I'm saying to persuade you. Oh, y'all need to JDGV it? I'm not in the business of being a people pleaser. Woo-hoo. Paul is saying, I need to be good with God. And he's saying one of the challenges of life as a believer, this is going to be challenging. I hope y'all ready to handle this. He says he puts in antithesis, direct opposite, being a people pleaser from being a servant or a bondservant of Jesus. Okay, y'all didn't catch it. Let me help y'all catch it. He says I have to make up my mind. Either I'm going to worry and work to please God, or I'm going to work to please you. And I want to go ahead and set the house straight, y'all, and deliver us. We need to work harder at not being people pleasers. I ought not make decisions so people will be pleased and so people will approve and so people will like me. Because the same people that approve of you can disapprove of you. And then you wind up on this roller coaster ride, and some days I'm up because people loving me, and some days I'm down because people not loving me. And I want to preach somebody off the roller coaster. It's time to live a solid life that at the end of the day, whether man likes you or not, at least God is pleased. Tell your neighbor, don't worry about pleasing people. Some of us, people got us jumping high and bending low, and we wind up exhausting ourselves because we want people to like what I'm wearing, and people to like what I got on, and people to like where I've been. You better stop worrying about folk that don't have heaven, nor hell, nor bill paying, nor anything to do in your life, and focus on Let me hang out here and park for a moment, y'all. And I'm not judging y'all, Saray. I'm simply saying this is something we all got to deal with. There was a whole set of songs. They had something ready to sing before I preach. Audrey wasn't scheduled to sing nothing. Y'all not hearing me. And fortunately, we have the maturity of our music department. That somebody's not sitting back with the attitude of, Man, I rehearsed that song all week. I've been waiting for that. I got my girlfriend here. She was going to hear me sing my lead. At the end of the day, we all going to wind up in situations where I got to choose. Is man going to be good or is God going to be good? And I want to deliver the house of God that if you got to choose between God and man, nudge your neighbor and tell him choose God every time. I'm learning something as I live my life. I'm learning something, y'all, that there's a group of people applauding and there's a group of people booing. Y'all gonna be shocked about what I'm saying. You got to ignore both. Because half the people applauding don't think you can do nothing wrong no way. And half the people booing don't think you can do anything right anyway. And the problem is if I keep gravitating toward the people that are applauding, they may applaud when I'm doing something wrong, which will move me away from God. If I move toward the people that are booing, I might wind up moving away from God. So I've learned to live my life smack in the middle. If some will boo, some will applaud, but don't get all bent out of shape about it. If I'm going to be a servant of Christ, I can't be a man pleaser. And I know some of y'all get disappointed when I preach these discipleship sermons where, Pastor, I need a word that's going to lift me. I need a word that's going to help me prosper. I need a word that's going to make me feel good. But sometimes I don't need a word that's going to make me feel good. I need a word that's going to grow me, a word that's going to discipline me, a word that's going to make me see different, a word that's going to make me live different. And at the end of the day, when man does not say, well done, I want to live my life and close my eyes and put my head on a pillow and hear the Lord say, well done. Paul says, I got to protect my personal testimony. He said, I got to make it a priority. And the worst thing, the Lord won't let me move because I want to see you delivered. I want to see you delivered from the exhaustion of keeping up with the popularity of people. It is exhausting to live your life in such a way, folks, especially now in this realm of social media, where everybody is peeping what you're wearing and who you're wearing and what you got on. Can some of us go ahead and post that I got this from the thrift store? We want to always, I ain't scared of y'all because I ain't trying to people please, I'm going God please. But we're quick to post all of the fancy names and all of the stuff. Brother sent me some shoes that were on sale for Nordstrom Rack with a JG on them. And I was looking at them thinking, I don't know who whatever Gailliard is. All I know is they had a JG on the shoe. And he was like, man, you need to get these shoes and JG your shoes so when you walk out, folk can see your initials on your shoe. And I said, bruh, JG in my shoes every Sunday. I don't need nothing on it to show JG got shoes on. And some of y'all, if you so bad that you're going to post all of the Prada and all the fancy stuff, why don't you post Goodwill? Post thrift store. But I don't because I'm stuck with pleasing people. Come on, come on, this is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to post your 20-year-old car with some banged up rims and show folk this is what I'm driving. But that's all right. My car better than yours because it's paid for. And all of the people quiet, all the people pleasers are quiet right now. He said that the root of the problem is that we have a moral crisis, not a theological crisis. Y'all know who God is. You know who Jesus is. You don't have a theological crisis. We have a moral crisis. Because at the root of it is people pleasing, which is idolatry. Because when I'm people pleasing, I make idols of other people. So I crave your approval Because at the end of the day, you are the one I am seeking to get affirmation from. He says, if I'm going to serve Christ, there's going to be some weeks folk not going to be happy. I just feel the Holy Ghost speaking to me right now. So if you just hang in there, one of these weeks going to be your week. You would think after Paul in verse 10 says, look, y'all, if you're going to be a servant, a bond servant of Jesus, you can't be pleasing people. And you would think when he got done with that, he would allow his intellect to kick in. You would think you would allow his training from the Old Testament to kick in. You would think that he would begin going through a long theological dissertation of why the gospel is the gospel. You would think that he would start pulling in proof text upon proof text to prove that why Jesus is who he is and why him alone is saved, is enough to be saved. Minister B, he doesn't do any of that. He gets done telling me not to please people. And this is what he says. I'm not even going to preach all my points. He said, I don't have to give you Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. I could give y'all my dissertation on why Jesus Christ alone is enough. I could start quoting all the New Testament that I wrote. I ain't worrying about, I ain't studying y'all. Because I could drag out all of the prophetic words of the Hebrew Bible so you could see all of the times he was foreshadowed to come and how he came. Because I could go through a whole litany of things, biblically, doctrinally, and theologically. I'm not wasting my breath with none of that. I believe the reason he doesn't waste his breath with none of that is because God led him to do something we can all do. This is what Paul says. Paul says, don't you know? Look at verse 13. Haven't you heard who I used to be? Yeah. Y'all missed it. He said, I don't need to give you Hebrew. All I gotta do is remind you of what he did for me. You may not believe it, but I know what he did in my life. I want to preach to somebody. Paul says, do you know how bad I was? Look at Acts chapter 19 when you get a chance. His story's in there. He said, don't you know I used to kill folk like you? He said, don't you know I was so stuck in Jewish tradition that I used my intellect and my knowledge as a justification for why I hated you? Don't you know there was a time in my life that not only was I not a Jesus lover, I was a Jesus hater. And so I'm going to tell you right now, I don't need to give you my degrees. This is what I'm going to tell you. I met a man named Jesus when I was sick and wounded and struggling, when I could not rescue myself and deliver myself, when I did not have confidence in myself. And this same Jesus that I was busy vilifying is the very one that turned my life around. And I don't know who I'm preaching to today, but it doesn't matter how much bad you have done, how much evil has been in your life, how long you have rejected God, that at the end of the day, God can change anybody. He says, I have a past. Can I give everyone in this room and everybody on East City campus permission to stop hiding from my past. I love this about Paul. He raises his hand and he says, did you hear about my former conduct? See, I know some of you can't say amen for the same reason some folk struggle with getting saved. See, folk only struggle from getting saved for one of two reasons. All that other deep stuff, it ain't deep like that. Two things keep me from running from God. The first thing that keeps me running from God is my immorality. Because I'm looking at my life and I'm thinking, I'm a mess. And I'm going to come, but before I come, I think I need to clean myself up a little bit. And I start to realize that no matter how much I try to clean me up, I can never clean me up enough. Because no matter, good Lord, can I tell you what the Lord put in my spirit? He said, Gailliard, you were so jacked up that no matter how high you could climb, you could never climb over yourself to get to me. He says, you can't get past you to get to me. That the only way you can get to me is to get you out of the way. And the only way you will get you out of the way is to own the fact that regardless of how messed up you are, I can handle it. That's half the room and half East City. Here's the other half. What keeps me running from God is, number one, my immorality, but number two, my morality. You don't realize it, but there are folk who think they don't need God because they don't sin like you sin. I'm good. I don't cheat on my wife. I'm good. I don't smoke weed. I'm good. I'm not in church drunk. I'm good. I'm not. And just because somebody sins less than you or even sins different than you does not mean they have the capability of being able. Y'all have heard me give the illustration before, but we got new folk. I don't care how long of a running start you get. If I got to leap off this stage and leap to the stadium seating, now I can leap, and I could almost make it to Dwight. Oh, that's right, I got it like that. I'm gonna wear my sneaks next Sunday. I need you to get in your spirit. Some folk can jump and get to here. Some folk can jump and get to here. Some folk can get to here. But everybody's short. As a matter of fact, help me preach. Tell your neighbor you're still short. You're still short. So Paul reminds us of his past. And I'm done when I say this. Verse 15, he said, not only is there a testimony of my past. Somebody needs to hear this. Whatever you have done, God can handle it. He can handle it. He can handle it. I just want you to get that in your spirit. I'm done. I got 5 points. I'm only going to preach this one and one more. Paul says, this is a testimony of my past. Don't you know who I was? But then he says, but when it pleased God. What's that, verse 17? Verse 15? He said, but when it pleased, y'all didn't catch it. Y'all didn't catch it. Didn't catch it. I did all I was doing, and I didn't even get right because I wanted to get right. He didn't say, but when it pleased Paul. He didn't say when I was tired. He didn't say when I was ready to surrender myself. He says, even though I had a past, I serve a God who has the testimony of a plan for me. And I want to speak this over somebody's life, that whatever has happened in your life, God still has a plan for you. And the reason I want you to get this thing in your spirit is because sometimes God's plan is not to please you. Sometimes his plan is to please, not sometimes, his plan is to always to please him. I want to deliver the house. Despite what my past is, you still have a plan from God. That God still has a purpose for your life. That God still wants the purpose to do something great in your life. He says, but when it pleased God. Let me put y'all in the text. Put Paul in there first. I was busy vilifying Christians, but when it pleased God. I was busy running my own life. Tristan got it, y'all miss it. But when it pleased God. I was busy making my own decisions. But when it, okay, y'all, all right, that's too heavy for y'all. That's too many words. Okay, let's try it over again. Let's just say, instead of but time, instead of it, but when it pleased God, let's make it simple. But when God. I was doing what I wanted to do, but when God. I was messing up my own life, but when God. Is there anyone in church with a testimony that I was out there doing whatever I was big and bad enough to do, but when God showed up, but when God showed another plan, but when God told me I could be more, but when God looked past my faults and found my sins, but when God, somebody shout, but when God. And despite what my situation is, God knows how to show up in it. You are a but when God story. I'm done. I got other stuff I can say, but there's no reason. I want you to get this in your spirit. Your autobiography is your best evidence. Okay, y'all missed it. All right. I didn't say your biography. See, your biography is what folks say about you. Your autobiography is what you say about you. Your autobiography is your best evidence that God can save anybody. Who am I preaching to? See, I know, I need y'all to get it. Y'all missing it. Don't miss it. I'm not going to let y'all miss it. See, what you don't have, this generation, I feel for y'all. Because what you don't have on TikTok and Instagram are autobiographies. What you have are highlight reels. That's why they call them reels. Nobody posting low-life reels. But your autobiography doesn't just have in it the days you were winning. It also has in it all the days you were losing. I wish I had a handful of people that could look over your life. It don't have just the days where you had money. It had days where you were trying to figure out how in the world you're going to pay your bills. So I don't need to hide about what I've been through and what has happened in my life, because God will use everything that has occurred in my life as my autobiography, as evidence that he can save anybody. All right, so let's do the laundry call real quick. Come on, let's air dirty laundry. Oh, see, now y'all quiet because your autobiography don't just have clean underwear. Let me call. Come on, let's call some stuff out. Don't stand up yet. We're going to all jump up at one time. Promiscuity, lying, sleeping around. Come on, help push out. judging folk, gossiping on folk, celebrating other people's failures, divorce, abortion. Y'all not talking, but that's all right. Incarceration, murder, rape, incest, manipulation. I ain't got y'all yet. I might as well add not tithing. That's half the room right there. Now, let me give you the last one. Not being saved. Because you weren't always saved. Now, if I ran off on this list, anything that you've ever experienced, jump up on your feet real quick. Tell your neighbor, I'm standing because I'm evidence that God can save anybody. And if he can save me with my story, and you don't know my story, but if he can save me, I promise you, you've not done anything so bad that he can't save you. God can fix any matter of brokenness. God can correct anything that's wrong. It's not too late because you still have breath in your body. So join me in praising a God that gives all of us a testimony that he can fix anybody. Come on, can you give him praise in this room and on East City campus? There is power. Tell your neighbor, there's power in your testimony. I want you all to remain standing. Media, give them verse 24. I'm going to show you the power of your testimony. It's in verse 24. Verse number 24, this is what Apostle Paul says. The Apostle Paul says, other folk were looking at my life. I didn't have to be busy preaching to them. They began glorifying God in me. Ooh. Media, y'all awake back there? Can y'all give me verse 24? People about to get saved. Verse 1, chapter 1, verse 24. And they glorified God in me. Here's the question. I want everybody looking at somebody, because you don't realize how much power is in you. Ask your neighbor, who was the last person that glorified God because of you? Not because James Gailliard preached. Who was the last person that gave God glory because of you? Who is honoring Christ today because of your life? Your testimony has so much power that it can cause unsaved people to glorify God because they're looking at you. That's how much power you have. And so before we pray and go home, you're in this room. We stood as a church. We made a declaration as a church, and we admitted in some shape, form, or fashion every sin imaginable to man. And we stood in acknowledgement that God can fix anything. And we can never let that be. We can never allow that message to be lost.